Hello there and welcome to The World Today on Channels Television. I'm Cynthia Are. Here are our top stories. Now, as the fight against the Islamic State continues, 30 countries have pledged to help Iraq fight the group by all means necessary. A joint statement by foreign ministers taking part in a major conference in Paris talks said support would include appropriate military assistance. The talks have been called to agree on a strategy to combat the group, which controls large parts of Iraq and Syria.
Initially, the Islamic State group known as IS was a threat to Iraq and Syria alone. A threat which, according to the United Nations, has displaced at least 1.8 million Iraqis.
The influx has created a massive shelter crisis, with more than half of those families sheltering in parks and other open areas, on the sides of highways, in unfinished buildings, in religious buildings and in schools. With more than 650 schools in Dohuk Governorate now hosting IDPs, thousands of Kurdish school children did not start school on the 10th of September as scheduled.
Then, upon the intervention of the United States, there was a cost: the lives of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. Over the weekend, the group added another martyr to their list: British aid worker David Haines. Like those before him, he was also beheaded.
This British man has to pay the price for your promise, Cameron, to arm the Peshmerga against the Islamic State. Ironically, he has spent a decade of his life serving under the same Royal Air Force that is responsible for delivering those arms. Your evil alliance with America, which continues to strike the Muslims of Iraq and most recently bombed the Haditha Dam, will only accelerate your destruction. And playing the role of the obedient lapdog, Cameron, will only drag you and your people into another bloody and unwinnable war.
And without delay, the condemnations come pouring in.
The humanitarian community lost a dedicated, wonderful, warm father of two member, David Haines. A barbaric act that only reminds us that there are huge risks for people who risk their lives to save the lives of others. Last year, the humanitarian community witnessed on a daily basis killings, kidnappings, attacks on humanitarian convoys, 450 times just in 1 year. And what I would like to suggest, before we start talking about another huge humanitarian catastrophe that requires the bravery of men and women, to pay a tribute to David Haines and respect his family with a minute of silence.
Now that the threat is expanding, saying it's time to address the situation is an understatement. For this reason, world leaders are meeting again in Paris, the same venue which they did when addressing the Boko Haram threat earlier this year. The Iraq conference sees foreign ministers from the main European states, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Iraq's neighbors, and Gulf Arab states Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE gathered to discuss political, security, and humanitarian aspects of tackling Islamic State. The United States has unveiled an outline plan to fight the Islamist militants simultaneously in Iraq and Syria. It believes it can forge a solid alliance despite hesitancy among some partners and questions over the legality of action, notably in Syria, where the militant group has a power base.
Now, as French President Francois Hollande meets in Paris with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and European Arab foreign ministers for talks on responding to President Obama's call for a broad coalition against Islamic State militants, the VOA State Department correspondent Scott Stearns is traveling with the Secretary, John Kerry, and has sent this in.
Comes to Paris after a week of talks in Baghdad, Amman, Jeddah, Ankara, and Cairo, trying to rally Arab leaders to join the U.S. coalition against the Islamic State. U.S. officials say there's broad agreement among Arab leaders about the severity of the threat and what they can do to undermine the Islamic State ideology and restrict its flow of financing and foreign fighters. So far, only the United States has taken military action in Iraq. France says it's willing to join those airstrikes, as have other Arab nations, but that has yet to been approved by the new government in Baghdad. These talks are meant to lead up to the UN General Assembly, where there's expected to be more public demonstrations of who will do what in this coalition.
Well, for more on the situation or what's happening in Paris, I'm now being joined by the Voice of America's Carla Babb via Skype. Carla, thank you so much for joining us again on The World Today.
Thank you for having me, as always.
Now, just as was hinted by Scott Stearns, and that just what we saw just now, the Paris conference is aimed at defining the role each member state will play. Now, any idea on what those specific roles might be per country?
Well, the role is going to be different for each different country, and then that's something that they're ironing out right now. They've said that this is going to be based on the Iraqi government's needs. So what they're doing now in Paris, who's wanting and willing to give what, and therefore putting that together. So this is